Seches Megillah Daf Yud. We begin with the Mishnah, which starts on the last 3 lines of Daf Tes and continues into Daf Yud. The Mishnah discusses the difference between the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim and the Mishkan in Shiloh, and what their differences are in halachos. The Daf will continue to discuss the halachos of the difference between the two, as far as whether the kedusha ends when the Beis Hamikdash or the Mishkan is charav. Is there still kedusha in the place, or does the kedusha end from there? The Gemara will then get into its analysis of Megillah Esther, beginning with what the word Vayihi refers to, and then various Tanaim and Amram and how they introduced their shiurim on the topic of Megillah Esther. So the Gemara begins. We'll start with the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that the only difference between Shiloh, which is where the Mishkan was before the Beis Hamikdash was built, the Mishkan from the Midbar was moved to Shiloh and made into a semi-temporary structure. So Mishkan Shiloh, the halacha over there was different than the halacha of the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim as far as the eating of light karbonos, kachim kalim, and ma'aser sheni. The halacha in Yerushalayim is that kachim kalim and ma'aser sheni could be eaten anywhere inside the walls of the city of Yerushalayim. Now Shiloh didn't really have city walls, so the distance that was equivalent to that was anywhere where you could see Shiloh. So anywhere on the surrounding mountainsides where you could see Shiloh was considered to be the city walls, and therefore you were allowed to eat it. So that's one difference between the two. Now, something that was similar between the two is the eating of kachim, that's higher level karbanos, like a karban chatas. There in the Beis Hamikdash, they could only be eaten within the walls of the Azara. In the Mishkan Shiloh, they could also only be eaten within the walls of the Azara, which, although there were no solid walls, they were set aside by curtains that surrounded the Azara. That's the courtyard where the outer Mizbeach stood itself. Now, the Mishnah says there's another difference between Shiloh and Yerushalayim, and that is that once Shiloh was destroyed, there was no longer any kedusha. The kedusha ended, but Yerushalayim, once it was destroyed, the kedusha continued, even though the Beis Hamikdash was charav, and the bringing of karbanos on the mizbeach had ended. Now, specifically what we're referring to here is the halacha of whether or not you're allowed to bring karbanos on private mizbechos. As long as there was a Beis Hamikdash or a Mishkan standing, you couldn't bring karbanos on private mizbechos. Once that kedusha ended, you could bring karbanos on private mizbechos. So what we're saying now, according to this Mishnah, is that when Mishkan Shiloh was destroyed, you went back to heter vamos. You could start bringing karbanos on private mizbechos people had in their backyards. However, once the Beis Hamikdash was built in Yerushalayim, either Beis Hamikdash, first or the second, there was no longer any leaving, there was no longer any departure of that kedusha, and therefore there was no longer a heter to have any bamos anywhere, even after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, and that's the status today. That's why we can't bring karbanos on any private mizbechos. So now the Gemara begins with the opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak, who seems to disagree. Rabbi Yitzchak says you're allowed to bring karbanos on Beis Chanyo. Chanyo was the son of Shemna Tzadik, and he built a mizbech in Mitzrayim. So Rav Yitzchak says you're allowed to bring karbanos on Beis Chanya even today. So now he has to tell two things. First of all, there's a dispute as to who that mizbech was built for. There are some who hold that it was built for Avodah Zarah. Obviously, Rav Yitzchak doesn't hold that way. It was not a mizbech for Avodah Zarah. It was Lashem. But he also holds that even though the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, even though he holds since the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, even though it had stood, we go back to heter bamos, and you are now again allowed to bring karbanos on private mizbeach once the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Now that's obviously contradicted by our Mishnah, which is as we are about to see. But first, the Gemara says, what is the source according to Rabbi Yitzchak of that halacha? The Gemara says this from the pasuk. He says, "Ki lovasam ad ata el hamunucha v'la nachla." You're allowed to eat karbanos outside the Beis Hamikdash because it wasn't built yet, and it says because you didn't come yet until the Menucha and until the Nachla, until the resting place and until the inheritance. So Menucha refers to the Mishkan in Shiloh, Nachla refers to the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, and the pasuk connects the two to teach the same halacha applies to both of them. Just like Mishkan Shiloh, you could go back to the Bamos after it was destroyed. Beis Hamikdash, you could go back to the Bamos after it was destroyed. That's what Rav Yitzchak says. So the Gemara says that the Chachamim said to Rav Yitzchak, "Did you really say this?" And he said to them, "No, I don't say this." So Rava says, like him, by God, yeah, I heard him say it. He said it, and I learned it from him. So obviously he said it, and he was chayzer, he changed, he retracted. So why did he retract? So the Gemara says because of these kashas. First of all, we have our Mishnah, which clearly says that after Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, there was kedusha still, and there were no heter vamos afterwards. We have another Mishnah that says once they came to Yerushalayim, the bamos became usher and were never given a heter anymore, and that is the nachla that's referred to in the psukim, but there is no hekesh to the menucha, and there is no heter for it at all. Okay, so therefore Rabbi Yitzchak was chazir. Now the Gemara wants to say though that this concept is a machlokas tanaim. There is a machlokas tanaim as to whether or not there was heter to bring the karbanos on private mizbechos once the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. The Gemara is going to try two attempts to show that this is machlokas tanaim. The first is a brayso talking about the rebuilding of the second Beis Hamikdash, and is a machlokas between Rav Eliezer and Rav Yeshua as to how the Beis Hamikdash operated while it was under construction. Rabbi Eliezer says they put up curtains right away to represent the walls of the Heichal, that's the building, the Dvir, the building of the Beis Hamikdash, and they put up curtains to represent the walls of the courtyard, the Azara that's around it. Now, Rabbi Yeshua says they didn't put up any walls, there was no issue. Now, let's read the brayso how Rabbi Eliezer describes his opinion, and Rabbi Yeshua describes his, and we'll see that there seems to be a machlokes about this concept. So Rabbi Eliezer says, I heard that they put up walls for they set up curtains for the Heichal, the walls of the Heichal, to represent the walls of the Heichal and the walls of the Azara. The difference between the two was that the curtains for the Heichal were set up on the outer edge of where the walls, on the inner edge, that is, of where the walls were meant to be, so that the workers who were building the walls were standing outside the curtains. And the walls of the Azara were represented by curtains which were set up on the inner walls, so that is on the outer walls, I should say, so that the workers who were building the walls of the Beis Hamikdash were standing within the curtains. And that's because the workers could stand in the Azara, but we did not want them standing in the Dvira, we did not want them standing in the Heichal. Now, that's all he says. Rav Yeshua says that no, you could bring karbanos even though there was no Beis Hamikdash. You could eat kachei kachim even though there were no curtains up. And you could eat kachim kalim even though there was no wall around Yerushalayim. You could do all these things, not a problem. So Rav Yeshua seems to indicate. Oh, and he even ends off and he says, and the reason is because the Kedusha Rishona is Kedusha L'Shaita and Kedusha L'Asid Lava. The original Kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash and Yerushalayim did not end. It never ended. And it still stood. It still continued. So, therefore, they didn't need to put walls up. You didn't have to have curtains anywhere. Everything was fine. Now that seems to indicate that Rabbi Eliezer argues, and he says, no, they had to put the walls up, otherwise they would not have been able to bring karbanos, because they would not have had Kedusha on the Mizbeach. And they would not have been able to eat kachei kachim in the Azara and kachim kalim in Yerushalayim without some type of representation of walls, because that original Kedusha had left. You needed to have a semblance of construction for the new Beis Hamikdash in order to be able to do these avodas. So the Gemara says, therefore, that's a proof that there's machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua whether the original Kedusha existed or not. So the Gemara says no. The Gemara says it's not a proof. They all agree that the original Kedusha existed. Rabbi Eliezer just says that this is how they did it. They put curtains up. They didn't have to, but that's how they did it. Why did they do it then if they didn't have to? They did it because of tznius, for privacy. Simply, you didn't want all the workers staring at the avodah and everything that was happening. But that is required in order to set up a Beis Hamikdash so that you could have Kedusha. That's not true. That's not what happened. The Gemara now introduces its second possible source that the concept of whether Kedusha falls off when Klal Yisrael leave or destroyed or had the Beis Hamikdash or Yerushalayim be destroyed, whether or not that Kedusha ends That is a machlokes Tanaim. We have our second source to that. Except it's actually not two different Tanaim. It's a contradiction within the same Tana, which we'll have to say are different Tanaim somehow. But this is concerning the topic of when Klal Yisrael came back to Eretz Yisrael from the exile, from Bavel, and they came and they found the cities, they were Mekadesh them. So were they Mekadesh them anew at the time, or did they retain their original Kedusha? So we're analyzing the Psukim, which say that they came back and they identified 9 cities. Rashi says 9, but by us the Psukim only have 8. The cities that had a wall from the times of Yeshua ben Nun, which is relevant to the halacha of Batei Rechoma, that is, that they can be redeemed up to 1 year if they were sold and not later than that. So the Gemara says that there's 2 different brises as to why these 9 were mentioned, because we know that there were 60. There were more than 60 such walled cities, as the pasuk says. So there were 60 specifically, and there were many more. As it says, Shishim Ir Kol Chevel Argov. That's where we get the number 60 from. So there were many, many walled cities from the times of Yeshua ben Nun. Why does the Psukim only mention the 8 or the 9? So one brisa quotes Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi, says the reason is because these were the ones that they were Mekadesh. The original ones lost their Kedusha, and when they came back from Bavel, they were Mekadesh these. The other ones did not have Kedusha, because Kedusha ended when Klal Yisrael were sent out of Eretz Yisrael. Different brisa says, no, they had the Kedusha stayed, never ended. But these were the ones that they found, and therefore these are the ones that they listed. But Kedusha never ended, even when Klal Yisrael went into exile. So this is also quoting Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi. You have a contradiction in Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi. So the Gemara therefore says, either it's 2 Tanaim that are arguing about what Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi says, or it's one of these is really Rabbi Lazar ben Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Lazar ben Rabbi Yosi holds that the Kedusha never ended. And he has another drasha for that. He says, from the pasuk which has Asher Loi Chayma with a Vav, which it's read as Lamed, it's spelled Lamed Vav Aleph, which is a combination of it has no wall or it has a wall. And what it means to say is that even if it had a wall once, but it doesn't have a wall anymore, it still counts as a city that has a wall, because that Kedusha does not end. So he's the one who holds that Kedusha never ends, but Rabbi Shmuel holds that it does end. Either way, we have a machlokes Tanaim as to whether or not Kedusha stops when there is a chorban, a destruction of some sort. We now begin the next part of the daf, which discusses the Megillah, begins a lengthy Agarata discussion analyzing the Psukim of Megillah Esther and the story of the Purim miracle. So it begins by referring to the word Vayihi. Megillah starts with the phrase Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh. So the Gemara quotes Rabbi Levi, who says that we have a tradition that any time you have the word Vayihi that's used, so we learn from Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, that's a sign of tsar, it's a sign of painful experiences up ahead. The Gemara lists a number of examples. Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh, and that's the time of Haman. Vayihi b'mei Shoat HaShoftim, and that is the time when there was a hunger. And it was at the time when people began to multiply on the face of the earth, and there was to say afterwards, Hashem saw that people were evil. And it was when they traveled to the east, and what happened? They built a tower to fight against the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Amraphel was in the days of King Amraphel. Also Muhammad, it says there was a war. Yeshua was in the time when Yeshua was in Yericho. It says he saw a malach and he came with a sword drawn to rebuke Yehoshua over not bringing the Karban Tamid and Bittul Torah. It says Vahi Hashem is Yeshua, Vayimalu b'nei Yisrael. It says Hashem was with Yeshua, and then Klal Yisrael stole from Yericho. It says Vahi Ish Echad min Haramasim, the beginning of Sefer Shmuel. It was one man from Ramah, and then it says, Ki es Chana oiv Hashem sagar rachma, the whole story with Chana, who didn't have children. So the Viki Zakin Shmuel, and Shmuel was old, and then right afterwards, Leihochu banav bedrachav, his sons didn't follow in his ways, and that was a sad thing. It says, Vehi David Choldor of Maskil, David was smart and leader in all his ways, and right afterwards, Vehi Shaul Oyen, as Shaul was eyeing David with jealousy. And lastly, it says, Vayhiki Yoshav HaMelech Bevesa, was when the king sat in his home, and he settled in Yerushalayim, and there's a time of sadness because Hashem told him, Rakata Lotivna Abayis, you will not be the one to build a Beis HaMikdash. And now the Gemara has a number of kashas where it says Vayhi, and it is not a time of sadness and suffering. So first is Vayhi B'Yom HaShmini, it says on the 8th day of the Shivas Yemei HaMeluim, when they began to inaugurate the Mishkan. So we have a verse that says that day was a day of great joy. It was a day of the joy that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had as the day that the entire world, the sky and the earth, the heavens and earth were created. Like it says here, Vayihi b'yom hashmi, and it says Vayihi erev vayivayker yom echad. And both using the word Vayihi, connecting the two. The Gemara says, well, it was a time of sadness because what happened is that Nadav and Avihu were killed in that event when they brought a carbon that they weren't supposed to, and they were destroyed. So the Gemara says, okay, answer that one, but I have a whole bunch more. It says, Vahi b'shmoinim shana v'arba meis shana, when the Klal left from Mitzrayim. So as Vikashra Yaakov is Rachel. Yaakov met Rachel for the first time. Where was the sadness there? It says, Vahi er vahi vayker yom echad, yom sheni, yom shlishi, all the days of creation. It says, Vahi. There's no sadness in any of these. So the Gemara therefore says we have to modify what we said. Vahi is not necessarily a sign of sadness. Some are sad and some are not. Vahi bimei, that is a sign of painful experiences ahead. And then we have 5 Vahi bimeis in Tanakh. Vahi bimei Achashverosh, we discussed. Vahi bimei Shel HaShoftim, we discussed. Vahi bimei Amraphel, we discussed. 2 more are Vahi bimei Achaz, in the days of Achaz. Achaz was a king of Yehuda, about whom it says that there was a war. He was attacked by neighboring countries. There was the king of Ramalia and Pekach, a lot of other things that happened. And the last Vayihi bimei is Vayihi bimei Yehoyakim, and that is when the Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash were destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, this all came from Levi. So Gemara now says there's another thing that Levi taught us, that it was a Mesorah, and this is that the people Amotz and Amatzah were brothers. Now, Amatzah was the king of Yehuda. Amotz was the father of Yeshayahu Hanavi. Gemara says, why do I need to know that they are brothers? And Gemara says, you need to know. You need to know because you need to know that Yeshayahu Hanavi was from Shevet Yehuda, was from the same chain of descent as the Malchus, and that's in order to understand that a Kala, a woman who is modest in the house of her father-in-law, she will have children who will be kings and prophets. Where do you see that? Tamar. Tamar was the daughter-in-law of Yehuda, and we know that she was modest because it says, Yehuda saw her and thought that she was a zona because she covered her face. So Gemara asks, why does covering your face mean you're a zona? So Gemara says, no, it means that she covered her face while she was in his house, and therefore she was very tzinu in his house, and he didn't recognize her, and therefore he thought she was a zona. And as a reward for that, she had descendants who were kings and Nevi'im, and there you have Amotz and Amatzi. Amatzi was the king, and Amotz was the father of a Navi, Yeshayahu Hanavi. Okay. Now, Rabbi Levi tells us the third thing from Mesorah, which is that the Aron itself took up no space. And we have a brayse that says that as well. It says that the size of the Aron was 10 amos. The space between the Aron and the walls of the Kodesh Kodashim was 10 amos in each direction. Now we know that the Kodesh Kodashim was only 20 amos by 20 amos, so 10 amos in each direction leaves no space in the middle, and therefore the Aron didn't take up any space. Now the brayse throws in another thing here, which the Rishonim take out, and talks about the fact that the Keruvim, which stood on the floor, had a wingspan of 10 amos by 10 amos, and that fills up the entire 20 amos, which doesn't really fit. But the Gemara says that, but the Rishonim remove this because it's not relevant to the proof that we have from here. All right, now the Gemara brings a number of ways that the Tanaim and Amoraim would introduce their discussion on Megillah Esther. Each one began with a certain drasha that they said on Psukim, which they said refers to people in the Purim story. So the Gemara starts with Rav Yonasan. So he quoted the pasuk in Yeshaya, which is Zukamti Alehem, and then later Vechrati Lebavel Shem Ushar V'nin V'nechanum Hashem. I will rise against them and I'll cut off from Bavel, name, relative, children, and posterity. Shem, Shar, Nin, V'neched. Says Rav Yonasan, Shem refers to the alphabet, the Babylonian script. Nobody's going to use that anymore. Sha'ar means their language will not be used anymore. Nin means their kingdom will be destroyed. There won't have any more kings. And Neched refers to Vashti. Neched means a grandchild. Refers to Vashti, who's a granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. that she will be destroyed. Shmuel bar Nachmani started teaching Megillah Esther with the following pasuk: Tachas hanatzutzi ala rosh v'sachat hafsirpadi ala hadas. Instead of the thorn, you'll get a evergreen tree, and instead of the sirpad, it's a different type of thorns, you'll get a hadas tree. So Tachas hanatzutz instead of the thorn means instead of Haman or Rasha. Natzutz refers to Avodah Zarah, and Haman made himself into Avodah Zarah. Natzutz refers to Avodah Zarah, like it says, V'chol natzutzim v'chol halolim. It's a pasuk in Yeshaya. It's not clear exactly how that refers to Avodah Zarah. But you'll get a Rosh. Rosh refers to Mordechai. Mordechai was called Virosh. Birosh means the first one. Mordechai was called the leader of all the psamim, all the spices, because it says Psamim Rosh, the leader of the spices, is Morderar. And Morderar is translated in Targum as Mordachia or Mordechai, which is Mordechai. Therefore, Mordechai is Morderar, and that's called Rosh, and therefore Mordechai is called Birosh. And when it says Tachas hanatzutzi ala Birosh, it refers to Mordechai. Now, Tachas sirpad. What's a sirpad? Sirpad is Vashti, because Vashti tried to stop the building of the Beis Hamikdash, so she was Saraf Rafida. Saraf Rafida means she burnt the Rafida. Rafida is a resting place, referring to the Beis Hamikdash, as it says, Rafida so Izav, Pasuk Shir Shirim, refers to the resting place of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as it were, on the Kaporis, which is made of gold. So, we'll get rid of Sirpad, that's get rid of Vashti, doesn't mean that it'll be replaced with Hadas, that's Esther. Esther is called Hadassah, like it says, V'hi Aminas Hadassah. Now, later it says, V'hi la Hashem l'shem, it should be la Hashem for a name. That means that the Megillah will always be read as the Persimei Nisa. Then it says, L'os olam lo yikares, it will never be cut off, an everlasting sign. That refers to Purim, which is never going to end. We'll always be celebrating Purim deep into the future. Now, Rabbi Shua ben Levi, when he started teaching Megillah Esther, he started with this pasuk. This is from the Tochacha. Just as Hashem rejoiced to do good to you, He'll rejoice to do bad to you. Versus, could it be that Hashem will rejoice to do bad? Hashem is never happy about the downfall, even of Rishaim. Two sources that Hashem is never happy about the downfall, even of Rishaim. One is a pasuk in Divrei Yamim, where it says, "B'teis lifnei hachalotz v'oimrim haidu la'Hashem ki la'olam chasdai." The Gemara says, "Why does it say haidu la'Hashem ki la'olam chasdai?" It should say haidu la'Hashem ki toiv ki la'olam chasdai. That's what it says everywhere else. Ki toiv is left out because we're talking about the downfall of Rishaim, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu never considers that to be good. There's never anything happy about that. Second source that is not happy about that. It says that v'leikarav zel zeh kol halayla. They didn't come near each other the entire night. This is at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf. The Gemara says that the Malachim wanted to say Shir to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, wanted to sing praise, and Hashem said, while the Mitzrim are drowning, you cannot sing praise. My handiwork, my creation, is drowning in the sea. You cannot sing songs of glad joy at that time. Okay, so what does it mean then when it says that Hashem will be happy to destroy us? What is the referring to? The Gemara says it means He will make others excited to destroy us. Like it says, Yosus, He will make others happy, not that He Himself will be happy, not Yosis. Okay, next, Bar Kahana started teaching Megillah Esther with the following pasuk: La'adam shetoiv l'fanav nasan chachma v'das v'simcha. Pasuk in Koheles. The man who pleases him, he's given wisdom, knowledge, and joy. Someone says that refers to Mordechai. Next, it says further in the pasuk, V'lachayt nasan inyan lasa v'luchnis. To the sinner, he gave the urge to gather and bring people together. That's referring to Haman. Next, the pasuk says, "Laseis latov l'fnei olakim," so that the sinner could pass it on to the one who is pleasing to God. Meaning, he took all these things that he gathered and he brought it together. All this money that he got, which Haman had a tremendous amount of money, he gathered it all because he was going to give it to the tzaddikim in the end. Who was that? Mordechai and Esther. In the end, he gave all his property. Ended up being given to Mordechai and Esther, as it says, "Atasim Esther is Mordechai al Beis Haman." Esther put Mordechai in charge of Haman's estate. Next, Rabbi Bar Ofran started teaching about Megillah Esther with this pasuk: "V'samti kisi be'elam v'havadti misham melech v'sarim." I'll put my throne in Elam. Elam refers to Persia, where Achashverosh ruled, and I will remove from there kings and princes. So kings is Vashti, who was the queen, and princes is Haman and the 10 sons. Rav Divan Bar Yitzchak introduced it from the following pasuk, and he said, "Ki avad menachnu uvavduseinu lo azavanu elokeinu vayat aleinu chesed lifnei malchi paras." We are slaves, but Hashem has not forsaken us. He directed the goodwill of the kings of Persia toward us. When does that happen? That pasuk, which is in Ezra, is referring to the time of the Purim story against Haman.